Hello, if you like exciting love stories, be sure to click on the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.
The Peterson house was alive with the sounds of clinking glasses, cheerful laughter, and the hum of conversation. Fairy lights adorned the backyard, casting a warm glow over the faces of friends and neighbors who had gathered to celebrate Mark and Laura Peterson's 15th wedding anniversary. Mark, 43, stood by the grill, flipping steaks while exchanging pleasantries with his guests. His face bore the weathered charm of a man who had worked hard to provide for his family. A well-paying job in finance, a spacious home, and a seemingly happy marriage. Yet, beneath his easygoing demeanor, there was a flicker of unease he couldn't shake. Laura, 41, moved through the crowd effortlessly, her sleek black dress and radiant smile drawing compliments and attention. She was the life of the party, a contrast to Mark's reserved nature. As she refilled wine glasses and laughed at anecdotes, her charm seemed effortless. But Mark noticed something different, an air of detachment he couldn't quite place. A suspicious moment as the evening progressed, Mark excused himself to grab more drinks from the kitchen. On his way inside, he passed Laura, who was huddled in a quiet corner with a man Mark didn't recognize. The man was tall, with an easy smile and a confidence that felt almost intrusive. Mark slowed his pace, his ears catching fragments of their conversation. "Not tonight," Laura said in a hushed tone. "We'll talk later." The man smiled. "I'm just saying, we shouldn't wait too long." Mark's chest tightened. He moved on, forcing himself not to overthink. "It's probably nothing, just an old friend or a coworker." But the seed of doubt had been planted. A private confrontation later that night, as the last guests trickled out and the house grew quiet, Mark approached Laura, who was clearing empty glasses from the living room. "You seemed cozy with that guy tonight," Mark said casually, though his tone betrayed his concern. Laura paused, her expression momentarily guarded before she forced a smile. "Oh, you mean Derek? He's just someone I know from work. He was asking about some investment advice." Mark nodded, though he wasn't convinced. "Seemed like more than that." Laura's smile faltered. "Mark, it's nothing. Can we not turn a good night into an interrogation?" Feeling the tension rise, Mark backed off, but his unease lingered. Doubts and distance the following week. The cracks in their marriage became harder to ignore. Laura spent more time on her phone, often stepping into another room to take calls or reply to messages. She seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere even when they were together. Mark tried to focus on work, but the image of Laura and Derek kept intruding on his thoughts. One evening, he checked her phone while she was in the shower, a line he never thought he'd cross. His heart sank as he read the messages. "Derek, thinking about you. Can't wait until we're together." "Laura, me too. Just a little longer." Mark sat frozen, the phone trembling in his hands. A sudden change the next morning. Mark woke to find Laura unusually cheerful. She hummed as she made coffee, her movements light and deliberate. "What's the occasion?" he asked, his tone tinged with suspicion. "Can a woman just be in a good mood?" Laura replied with a smile. Mark didn't push further, but his mind raced. What was she hiding? That evening, while Laura was out at a supposed work dinner, Mark began his own investigation. He searched her laptop and found an itinerary for a flight booked to Miami, a destination Laura had never mentioned. The flight was set for the following weekend, and it was booked for 2 people. The tipping point Mark confronted Laura the next day. "Who's Derek?" he demanded, his voice steady but firm. Laura blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Why are you asking about him?" "Because I know you're lying to me," Mark said, his voice rising. "I saw the messages. I know about the flight to Miami." Laura's expression hardened. "You went through my things?" "I had to," Mark shot back. "You've been hiding something from me. Don't deny it." Laura sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine. Yes, I've been talking to Derek. And yes, I'm leaving." Mark stared at her, stunned. "Leaving? For him?" Laura nodded, her eyes cold. "We've grown apart, Mark. You know that. Derek, he makes me feel alive again." Mark felt the floor drop out from under him. "After everything we've built, you're just walking away?" Laura's voice softened, but her resolve didn't waver. I'm sorry, Mark. I can't stay in a marriage where I don't feel anything anymore. As Laura walked out of the room, Mark stood frozen, the weight of her words crashing over him. The festive evening that had celebrated their life together now felt like a cruel prelude to its unraveling. The silence in the house was deafening. Laura's revelation left Mark reeling, a mix of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief coursing through him. He sat at the edge of their bed, his head in his hands, replaying her words over and over. Derek makes me feel alive again. The betrayal felt like a knife to the chest. For 15 years, he had built his life around Laura, believing their bond was unshakable. Now, that foundation was crumbling, and Mark didn't know how to stop it. A house divided. The following days were tense. Laura stayed in the guest bedroom, avoiding Mark except for brief, curt exchanges. She was making arrangements to leave, her departure date looming closer. The house, once warm and filled with shared memories, now felt like a battleground of unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Mark tried to focus on work, but the weight of the situation bled into everything. He found himself snapping at colleagues, forgetting deadlines, and staring blankly at his computer screen. His boss, noticing the change, called him into her office. "Mark, is everything all right?" she asked gently. Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it's not. My wife, she's leaving me." His boss's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. Take some time if you need it. Sometimes stepping back can help you see things more clearly." Mark nodded, grateful for her understanding, but the idea of stepping back felt impossible. The life he had known was slipping away, and he couldn't just watch it happen. Seeking answers one night, unable to sleep, Mark wandered into the living room and sat by the cold, empty fireplace. His gaze fell on the family photo above the mantel, a picture from their last vacation together. Laura's smile seemed genuine, but now he wondered if it had been a facade. His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was his sister, Evelyn, a no-nonsense woman who had always been his confidant. "I heard what happened," she said after he picked up. "Laura's leaving?" "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice hollow. "For another man." Evelyn's voice hardened. "That woman doesn't know what she's throwing away. Have you tried talking to her? Really talking?" Mark sighed. "She's already made up her mind." "Maybe," Evelyn said, her tone softening. "But if this is really the end, don't you want to understand why? You deserve that much, Mark." Her words stayed with him. That night, Mark resolved to confront Laura, not to plead or argue, but to get the answers he needed. A painful conversation the next morning. Mark found Laura in the kitchen, sipping coffee. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. "Can we talk?" Mark asked, his voice steady. Laura hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Mark sat across from her, his gaze unwavering. "I need to know, when did this start? When did we stop being enough?" Laura looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing its rim. "It wasn't about you, Mark. Not entirely. It's about me. I've felt empty for a long time, like I've been living someone else's life." Mark frowned. "I thought we were happy. I thought I was making you happy." "You did in the beginning," Laura said. "But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. And Derek, he reminded me of who I used to be." Mark clenched his fists under the table. "So you're leaving to find yourself? With him?" Laura met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "I'm sorry, Mark. I know this hurts, but I can't stay in a life where I feel like I'm disappearing." Her words cut deep, but they also left Mark with an unsettling realization. He had been so focused on building a stable life for them that he hadn't noticed Laura slipping away. The fallout Laura's confession set off a cascade of emotions in Mark: anger at her betrayal, sadness at their unraveling, and frustration at his own blindness. He spent hours pacing the house, replaying their arguments, and searching for where it had all gone wrong. One evening, Evelyn called again. "You sound exhausted," she said after Mark recounted the conversation. "I am," Mark admitted. "I don't know how to fix this." Evelyn's voice was firm. "Maybe it's not about fixing it. Maybe it's about finding a way forward, with or without her. A glimmer of resolve inspired by Evelyn's words, Mark began to shift his focus. He started running again, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. He cleaned the house, purging it of the clutter that reminded him of better times. And he sought help. A therapist, recommended by a colleague, helped him untangle the emotions he had buried for years. "You've been prioritizing everyone else's needs for so long," the therapist said during one session. "When was the last time you asked yourself what you want?" Mark didn't have an answer, but the question lingered. An unexpected encounter one afternoon, as Mark sat at a cafe, flipping through an old journal Laura had given him years ago, he overheard a conversation at the next table. A man in his late 40s was speaking animatedly to a friend. "Sometimes you have to let go to find yourself again," the man said. Mark's ears perked up. He turned slightly, catching the man's eye. "Sorry, I couldn't help but overhear," Mark said. "What you said. It struck a chord." The man smiled. "Sounds like you're going through something." Mark nodded, and before he knew it, they were deep in conversation. The man, Greg, had gone through his own divorce years ago and now ran a support group for men navigating similar challenges. "If you ever need to talk, come by," Greg said, handing Mark a card. Mark pocketed it, feeling a spark of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. A storm brewing back at home, the tension between Mark and Laura reached a boiling point as the date of her departure neared. Boxes began to fill the guest room, a visible reminder of the life she was preparing to leave behind. One evening, Mark found her sitting in the living room, staring at a framed photo from their wedding. "Why did you keep this?" he asked, his voice soft. Laura sighed. "Because it was real. Even if it didn't last, it mattered." Mark nodded, his heart heavy. "It still does." As Laura looked away, Mark felt the weight of finality settling over them. The storm was about to break, and he wasn't sure if either of them would emerge unscathed. The morning of Laura's departure arrived like a heavy fog, suffocating the house with an unbearable stillness. The sound of Laura's footsteps echoed through the halls as she moved boxes to the car. Mark stood in the kitchen, gripping a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He had imagined this moment 100 times in the past weeks, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. A part of him wanted to stop her, to beg her to stay, but a deeper part knew there was nothing left to say. "Goodbye," or something like it. Laura entered the kitchen, her coat slung over one arm and her purse in hand. She looked at Mark, her face a mix of resolve and regret. "I guess this is it," she said softly. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, I guess it is." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. "I never wanted to hurt you," Laura said, her voice breaking slightly, "but I need to do this, for me." Mark met her gaze, his own eyes filled with pain. "I just hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." Laura hesitated, as if searching for something to say, but finally just nodded. "Take care of yourself, Mark." And then she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft click that reverberated through the empty house, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. The weight of loss. The days following Laura's departure were a blur. The house, stripped of her presence, felt larger and emptier than ever. Mark moved through it like a ghost, avoiding the guest room where the lingering scent of her perfume was too much to bear. At work, his colleagues tiptoed around him, their sympathetic glances only deepening his sense of isolation. Even Evelyn, his steadfast sister, seemed unsure how to comfort him. One evening, as he sat on the couch flipping aimlessly through channels, Mark came across an old home video from a vacation he and Laura had taken years ago. On the screen, Laura laughed as she tried, and failed, to set up a tent. Mark's younger self teased her, the camera shaking with his laughter. Mark turned off the TV abruptly, unable to watch anymore. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his grief finally breaking him. A new routine in the weeks that followed. Mark began to establish a new routine. He started attending Greg's support group, where he met other men navigating the complexities of separation and divorce. "Every ending is a beginning," Greg often said. "It's not about what you've lost. It's about what you can build from here." Mark was skeptical at first, but as he listened to others share their stories, he began to feel less alone. Slowly, he started to reflect on his own life, not just as Laura's husband, but as an individual. "What do you want now?" one group member asked him during a session. Mark didn't have an answer, but the question stayed with him. An unexpected encounter one afternoon. While sorting through boxes in the attic, Mark came across an old leather journal tucked away in a corner. Curious, he opened it and found that it was Laura's, a record she had kept during the early years of their marriage. The entries were filled with heartfelt observations about their life together, her dreams, and her struggles. But as the years went on, the tone shifted. "I feel like I'm losing myself. Mark is wonderful, but I don't think he sees how unhappy I've become." The words stung, but they also offered clarity. Laura's decision hadn't been sudden. It had been building for years. Mark realized that he had been so focused on providing stability that he had overlooked her growing discontent. It was a painful truth, but one he couldn't ignore. A glimpse of freedom inspired by the group's emphasis on rediscovery, Mark began to explore interests he had long neglected. He joined a hiking club, rediscovering his love for the outdoors, and started painting again, something he hadn't done since college. One weekend, on a whim, he signed up for a photography workshop. It was there that he met Sophie, a fellow participant in her late 40s with a quick wit and a passion for capturing life's quiet moments. Sophie's energy was infectious, and Mark found himself laughing more than he had in months. "You have an eye for composition," Sophie remarked one day as they reviewed their photos. Mark smiled. "Thanks. It feels good to create something again." Their conversations grew longer, stretching from workshop hours to coffee breaks. Sophie's easygoing nature was a refreshing contrast to the heaviness Mark had been carrying. Confronting the past one evening, Mark received an unexpected text from Laura. "I hope you're doing okay. I'd like to talk, if you're open to it." Mark stared at the screen, conflicted. Part of him wanted to ignore her, but another part knew that closure required facing her one last time. They met at a park near their old home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. "You look well," Laura said as they sat on a bench. "So do you," Mark replied, his tone neutral. There was a pause before Laura spoke. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for how everything happened. I know I hurt you." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now that we both made mistakes. I wasn't paying attention to what you needed, but I also deserved honesty." Laura looked down, guilt flickering across her face. "You're right, and I'm sorry for that too." Mark exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "I'm moving forward, Laura. I hope you are too." "I am," Laura said softly, "and I hope you find happiness again. You deserve it." As she walked away, Mark felt a sense of finality, but also freedom. The turning point back at home, Mark reflected on the encounter. For the first time in months, he felt at peace with the past. He wasn't the same person he had been when Laura left, and that was a good thing. When Sophie texted later that evening, asking if he wanted to grab coffee, Mark smiled. "How about tomorrow?" he replied. It wasn't a new beginning with Laura, but it was a beginning nonetheless. One rooted in hope, self-discovery, and the possibility of something better. Mark's life had become a quiet blend of old habits and new experiences. The days were no longer filled with the weight of what he had lost, but with the promise of what he could create. He found himself smiling more often, appreciating the simple things. His morning coffee, a good book, the satisfaction of finishing a hike. Sophie had become a steady presence in his life. Their coffee meetups turned into dinners, and those dinners turned into long walks through the park. She had a way of making Mark feel like himself again, without the pressure to explain his past or prove anything. An unexpected opportunity one afternoon, Mark received a call from an old college friend, Tom. "Mark, long time no talk," Tom said warmly. "Listen, I'm heading up this art exhibition downtown, and we're looking for local artists to showcase their work. I remember you used to paint. Any chance you've still got it in you?" Mark hesitated. "I haven't picked up a brush seriously in years." "Doesn't matter," Tom replied. "If you've got something to share, we'd love to have you." Think about it. After the call, Mark stared at his modest setup in the corner of the living room. His recent paintings were small, intimate pieces, sunsets, quiet forest scenes, still life studies. None of them felt like they belonged in an exhibition, but the idea of sharing his work stirred something inside him. Sophie's encouragement later that evening, Mark mentioned the call to Sophie over dinner. "You should do it," Sophie said, her eyes lighting up. "Your work is beautiful, Mark. It deserves to be seen." Mark shook his head. "It's not good enough. These are just personal pieces. Therapy. More than anything else." Sophie reached across the table, taking his hand. "Maybe that's exactly why they're good enough. Art isn't about perfection. It's about connection." Her words stayed with him long after their dinner ended. Diving into the work over the next few weeks, Mark threw himself into painting with a renewed sense of purpose. He experimented with bolder colors, larger canvases, and more abstract forms. Each brushstroke felt like a step forward, away from the pain of his past and toward a future he was shaping for himself. Sophie often stopped by his house to check on his progress, bringing snacks and offering encouragement. "This one's my favorite," she said one day, pointing to a painting of a rocky shoreline bathed in golden light. Mark smiled. "It's inspired by a trip Laura and I took years ago. Funny how something painful can turn into something beautiful." Sophie nodded. "That's the magic of creating, isn't it?" The night of the exhibition arrived, and Mark stood nervously among the other artists, his paintings displayed on a wall lit by soft spotlights. He wore a navy blazer Sophie had insisted he buy, and he felt a mix of pride and vulnerability as strangers wandered by, pausing to admire his work. Sophie appeared at his side, her smile radiant. "How are you holding up?" "Terrified," Mark admitted. She laughed. "Good. That means you care." As the night went on, Mark received compliments from attendees and even a few inquiries about purchasing his pieces. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. Not as Laura's husband, or as the man she had left, but as himself. Facing the past again toward the end of the evening, Mark noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Laura. She approached hesitantly, her expression unreadable. "I heard about the exhibition," she said softly. "I wanted to see it for myself." Mark nodded, his heart pounding. "Thanks for coming." Laura studied the paintings for a moment before turning to him. "They're incredible, Mark. You've always had a talent for this." Mark smiled, the compliment bittersweet. "It's been healing in a way." "I'm glad," Laura said, her voice sincere. "You seem happy." "I am," Mark replied, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Strengthened moving forward after Laura left, Sophie rejoined Mark, sensing the moment had been significant. "You okay?" she asked gently. Mark nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Yeah, I think I finally am." Sophie smiled, looping her arm through his. "Good. Now let's go celebrate. You've earned it." As they left the gallery, Mark felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. His life wasn't defined by Laura's departure anymore. It was defined by his choices, his growth, and the relationships he was building in the present. A new chapter in the weeks that followed. Mark continued to paint, hike, and nurture his connection with Sophie. Together, they explored new trails, attended local events, and supported each other's passions. One sunny afternoon, as they sat by a lake, Sophie turned to Mark. "You know," she said, her voice playful, "you're not the same man I met at that workshop." Mark chuckled. "And who was that?" "Someone lost," Sophie said. "But now, you're someone who knows where he's going." Mark smiled, the words sinking in. He had found a path forward, not despite the pain he had endured, but because of it. Mark stood in the center of his living room, surveying his transformed space. The walls, once bare and muted, were now adorned with his paintings, each piece a reflection of his journey. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and fresh canvas, a testament to the creative life he had embraced. Sophie entered, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries. "You know, you could open your own gallery at this rate," she teased, setting the tray on the coffee table. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." I'm still figuring out what all this means. Isn't that the fun part? Sophie said, settling onto the couch. Mark sat beside her, his smile softening. It is. And I never thought I'd get here. A new bond over the months, Mark and Sophie's relationship had blossomed. They shared their pasts in late-night conversations, explored their shared love of art and nature, and supported each other through life's small challenges. One evening, as they watched a movie at Mark's house, Sophie glanced at him thoughtfully. Do you ever think about what would have happened if things hadn't fallen apart with Laura? She asked gently. Mark considered the question, his gaze distant. I used to, but now, I think it was something that needed to happen. We both lost ourselves in that marriage. Letting go was painful, but it gave me a chance to rediscover who I am. Sophie smiled, squeezing his hand. And who you are is pretty amazing. Mark laughed, his heart full. The next step, one sunny Saturday, Mark and Sophie decided to visit a nearby town known for its vibrant art scene. As they strolled through the cobblestone streets, Sophie noticed a small gallery with a "Call for Local Artists" sign in the window. She tugged Mark's arm excitedly. Look, this could be perfect for you. Mark hesitated, the familiar doubts creeping in. I don't know, Sophie. What if it's not good enough? Sophie turned to him, her expression firm but kind. Mark, your work tells a story. It's raw, honest, and beautiful. You've already proven you can do this. Now it's time to take another step. Her confidence in him was infectious. With a deep breath, Mark entered the gallery and spoke to the owner about submitting his work. A reunion of sorts later that week, Mark received a call from Evelyn. You'll never guess who I ran into, she said, her voice tinged with amusement. Who? Mark asked, curious. Laura, Evelyn replied. She mentioned seeing your exhibition and said she was glad you're doing well. Mark felt a pang of something. Nostalgia, perhaps, but it quickly passed. That's good to hear. I hope she's doing well too. She seemed happy, Evelyn said. And I think she's genuinely proud of you, Mark. Mark smiled faintly. Life has a funny way of working out, doesn't it? Celebrating new beginnings, the day of the gallery showcase arrived, and Mark found himself surrounded by a crowd of art enthusiasts. His pieces were displayed prominently, each one bearing a small plaque with its title and inspiration. As Mark mingled with the guests, he overheard snippets of conversations about his work. This one's my favorite, a woman said, pointing to a painting of a rocky shoreline. It feels hopeful. Mark smiled to himself, grateful that his story was resonating with others. Sophie appeared by his side, holding 2 glasses of champagne. To you, she said, handing him a glass. To us, Mark corrected, clinking his glass against hers. A reflective moment that evening, after the gallery had closed and the streets had quieted, Mark and Sophie walked hand in hand along the waterfront. The moon cast a silver glow over the water, and the air was filled with the scent of salt and blooming flowers. I was thinking, Mark began, his voice thoughtful. For so long, I saw what happened with Laura as the end of everything. But now, I see it as a beginning. Sophie squeezed his hand. It's amazing what can grow from the ashes, isn't it? Mark nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. I never thought I'd feel this way again. But with you, I do. Sophie smiled, her eyes shining. And I never thought I'd meet someone who could see the beauty in starting over. You inspire me, Mark. They stopped walking, the soft sound of waves filling the silence between them. Mark turned to Sophie, his gaze steady. I don't know what the future holds, he said, but I know I want to face it with you. Sophie's smile widened as she leaned in, their foreheads touching. Then let's do it together. A life rebuilt. Mark's journey wasn't about forgetting his past, but about learning from it and using those lessons to build something stronger, something truer. His art became a way to process, heal, and inspire others, while his relationship with Sophie reminded him of the beauty in second chances. As they walked back toward the lights of the town, Mark felt a profound sense of peace. His life was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he had found, and by the promise of what was yet to come. Months passed, and Mark's life continued to bloom in ways he hadn't imagined. His artwork gained recognition, with pieces displayed in multiple galleries. His relationship with Sophie deepened, becoming a source of steady joy and companionship. Yet, despite all the progress he had made, life had one more unexpected chapter in store for him. A familiar face one rainy afternoon, as Mark worked on a new painting in his studio, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. Wiping his hands on a rag, he went to answer it, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. Standing on his porch, soaked from the rain and looking far from the confident woman he remembered, was Laura. "Laura?" Mark said, his voice laced with surprise. She offered a hesitant smile, clutching her coat tightly around her. "Hi, Mark. Can I come in?" Mark hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. An unexpected apology, they sat at the kitchen table, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Mark made tea, his movements deliberate as he tried to decipher the reason for her visit. "I know this is unexpected," Laura began, her voice quieter than he remembered. "But I've been thinking about everything about us." Mark raised an eyebrow, saying nothing but giving her the space to continue. "When I left, I thought I was running towards something better," she said, her gaze fixed on her hands. "But I've realized I was running away, from myself, from my own unhappiness. And I blamed you for things that weren't your fault." Mark leaned back in his chair, her words both validating and unsettling. "Why now, Laura? Why tell me this after all this time?" Laura looked up, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Because I needed to say it. And because I owe you the truth. You deserved better than the way I left. Closure or confusion." Mark took a deep breath, processing her words. Part of him felt vindicated, hearing her acknowledge her role in their breakup. But another part of him felt a flicker of unease. What did this mean for his new life? "I appreciate you saying that," Mark said carefully. "It's taken me a long time to move forward, Laura. Hearing this helps, but it doesn't change where I am now." Laura nodded, her expression tinged with sadness. "I can see that. And I'm glad you found peace. You look happy." "I am," Mark replied honestly. "And I hope you find the same for yourself." Laura smiled faintly, then reached into her bag, pulling out a small envelope. "I found this while going through some old things. I thought you might want it." Mark took the envelope and opened it, revealing a photograph of them from their first anniversary. They stood in front of a small cabin, arms around each other, their smiles radiant. "It's a good memory," Laura said softly. Mark studied the photo for a moment before setting it on the table. "It is. And I think that's how I'll choose to remember us, by the good." An internal debate after Laura left. Mark found himself sitting in the quiet of his studio, the photograph still in his hand. The emotions stirred by her visit were complex, gratitude for the closure she had offered, but also a lingering question he couldn't shake. Was there more to her visit than an apology? Had she come seeking reconciliation? That evening, he shared the encounter with Sophie, who listened intently without interrupting. "How do you feel about it?" she asked after he finished. "I'm not sure," Mark admitted. Hearing her take responsibility for what happened felt good. But it also reminded me of everything I've let go of, and how far I've come. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think she wants to come back?" Mark hesitated. "Maybe. But even if she does, I know that chapter is closed for me." Sophie smiled, a mixture of relief and pride on her face. "You've come a long way, Mark. And I'm glad you know what you want." A chance encounter. Weeks later, Mark attended a local art fair to showcase his work. As he wandered through the event, admiring the talent of other artists, he spotted Laura across the venue. She was laughing with a group of friends, her expression lighter than he had seen it in years. For a moment, their eyes met. Laura offered a small wave, and Mark nodded in return. In that instant, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. He realized that their paths had diverged for a reason, and while their story had been painful, it had also been necessary. A final reflection that night, as Mark sat by the fireplace with Sophie, he reflected on the journey he had taken, from heartbreak to healing, from loss to love. "Do you ever wonder why things happen the way they do?" Mark asked, his gaze fixed on the flames. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder. All the time. But I think it's less about why and more about what we do with it. Mark smiled, wrapping an arm around her. Then I'd say we've done pretty well. Sophie laughed softly. I'd say so too. As they sat together, the photograph of Mark and Laura from years ago sat tucked in a drawer. A memory of a life that had shaped him but no longer defined him. A thought-provoking ending Mark's encounter with Laura reminded him of the fragility and resilience of human connections. It wasn't just about finding closure or moving on. It was about understanding that every chapter, no matter how painful, played a role in shaping who he had become. The listener is left to ponder. How do we reconcile the parts of our past that stay with us? Can we fully move on? Or do we carry fragments of those connections, shaping us in ways we can't fully understand?